Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. So where do you want to start, Rory?
Alastair, I wanted to start with a question that we often come to, because you often say, with a lot of reason, that one of the factors in British politics is the domination of right-wing media. So, Chris Porters, what will the right-wing press and all the client journalists do for the next 5 years once Labour are elected? So, I'd love you to reflect on that, but I'd also want to understand, why is the right-wing press so dominant? And is it possible, says he cheekily, that left-wing journalism is a little bit more boring? And even if people aren't really right-wing, the punter prefers buying a right-wing newspaper, or am I missing something?
Look, I think it's a pretty simple answer as to why it's so right-wing, is that the ownership is concentrated in a very, very small number of hands. Murdoch's obviously, the Murdoch press is still very powerful in terms of the media landscape. The Express itself is ridiculously right-wing and something of a comic. The Telegraph has got more and more right-wingers. The Conservative Party has got more and more right-wing. So the ecosystem is right wing, I think, because of the ownership. I also think that there is something inherently small c and sometimes large c conservative about an older newspaper reading public.
Older people are more likely to read newspapers than younger people at the
And
moment.
I think the older versions of the newspaper reading public, maybe do. I don't know whether we get more. You keep saying I get more left wing with age, but I think that's probably bucking the trend slightly. But I also think that I think you got a point about the boringness. Maybe boring is the wrong word, but I think sometimes the left wing media is maybe a bit worthy. And no, I would say that for
Nobody's ever accused the Sun of being worthy, have they?
no. And when I was on the Mirror, which obviously left wing paper, we weren't worthy, but I think I do think we wouldn't necessarily do the kind of things that the right wing don't find any trouble doing whatsoever. But what will they do? I think you're starting to see already what they will do, the right wing press and the client journalists. You're seeing it, for example, in the way that they keep trying to get this Angela Rayner story off the ground because they want a Labour scandal. Now, if you see some of the things, let's give you a tiny example. The other day, when we talked about it briefly, when Chris Philp, the minister, didn't seem to know the difference between Congo and Rwanda.
That was pretty amazing. I mean,
It was
really.
pretty amazing, but he was back on the television representing the government at the weekend, and he wasn't. So far as I'm aware, I don't think he was even asked about the sort of embarrassment. Now, if that had been a Labour person who'd made that sort of error, it would have been so big in the newspapers that for ever and a day he would be associated with it. A little bit like Diane Abbott was with getting her sums wrong once. So I think that's the big difference. And then I think the other thing is that the benefit of the doubt that the Tories keep getting over policy and policy mishaps, Labour just won't get the benefit of the doubt. And I actually think Labour have made a mistake in essentially giving up on the whole Leveson process. I think there is something deeply wrong with our press culture, and the fact of Leveson, the inquiry that was called into phone hacking, the fact that it was stopped halfway through before they got onto the issue of the press and the police and their relationship, and that's just gone now. Theresa May didn't want to open it. David Cameron wanted to let it go. But I actually think Labour should have kept that sort of, at least on the back burner, because what's happened since that, I think the press has got worse because they thought, they don't want to take us on. Very interesting one in Germany at the moment, Rory. Maximilian Krah is the leading AfD candidate in the list system for the European elections in Germany. And he essentially has become a non-person because one of his aides, one of his closest advisors, has been arrested for spying for China. And it's too late to take Krah off the list. Maximilian Krah we've talked about him on the podcast before. He is very, very, very right-wing. And so he cannot, it's too late to take him off the list. So he remains what's called the Spitzenkandidat. He's the number one candidate on the list. But they've announced, the AfD have announced that he will not be appearing in interviews. He will not be appearing in events. He will not be appearing on literature.
Yeah.
So he's been sort of made a non-person. And yet he is the number one candidate. So it'll be very interesting to see whether that affects their vote.
This is similar to what the situation that Labour faced in Rochdale, which is the scandal broke
Absolutely.
when they already had their party on the list, and that's what
Exactly.
led to George Galloway winning in that
Exactly.
case.
By the way, where the hell has he gone since? Let's not even bother with that. Right. I mean, what does he do? He was meant to be the guy for Gaza and all the rest of it. There's all this. I can't remember the last time I heard him speak. Purple Alogia.
He'd probably say that all the media is biased against him, and he's not.
Yeah. Purple Alogia. Who would you vote for? Don't worry, Rory. I'm not going to ask about Susan Hall again. Who would you vote for if you were a citizen of India, Thuringia, and the US this year? I'm going to go. Oh God. I mean, Congress, I guess. We'll really get some grief for that. America, obviously, Biden. Thuringia is fascinating because at the moment, in the polls, the AFD are about 10 points ahead of the Christian Democrats, followed by the Linke. SPD are right down on 7.5. Greens are on 5. FDP, the Free Democrats, the other member of the coalition, they're on 2. So, I mean, I would try to work out how best to stop the AFD, I guess, but they're looking pretty good. So, what about you, Roy, in India? Who are you going for?
Yeah, I mean, so India. I've as you know just come back from the States, and I've had increasing numbers of people, academics and students at Yale, talking about just how bad Modi's India is becoming, particularly in treatments of Muslims. And it was interesting, as we said, when we came out and did a program quite critical of Modi, we began to get a little bit of cyber warriors coming in from Modi's camp. But one of the things they said is how depressed they are by the failure of the US and Europe and Britain to criticize Modi properly. They keep saying that, this is a proper authoritarian government that, following on from the theme we often talk about, if you hear him in the Hindi media, and we should start listening more to the Hindi media speeches, he is saying the most outrageous things about Muslims. This is the first government almost in Indian history without a single Muslim representative at the federal level and only one at the regional level. I mean, and if you are a Muslim going into the Indian civil service at the moment, you face the most intense discrimination. And yet, because everybody's worried about China, of course, and people are falling over backwards in the US and Europe to praise Modi all the time.
And also because so many of these countries are trying to get really, big trade deals. So he has both economic, strategic, and political power, and he uses it very, very ruthlessly.
And voter demographic power too, because this is somebody who in Paris and in London and in Madison Square Garden can turn out hundreds of thousands of, British Indian citizens or American Indian citizens and prove that, there's a lot of voters in our own countries who are very supportive of Modi. But what they're saying, and I think it's a fair call, is by all means have a strategic alliance with him, but don't go out saying this is the greatest democracy in the world, this man's a great Democrat. Use more of the language you use with Saudi Arabia, which is we don't agree on all our values, we don't agree with what's happening, but this is an important strategic alliance.
I think also the fact that it is technically the biggest democracy in that it is the one in which there will be the most people voting. But over time, that has established itself as the biggest democracy in the world. But I've seen very little debate about the extent to which it is or isn't a really fully functioning democracy. And of course, what you know with people who stay in power for a long time is that the longer that they get in, if they do have anti-democratic instincts, then the more those anti-democratic instincts are going to play out. Same theme, Rory, slightly different, but because I was on the Trevor Phillips show on Sky at the weekend, and Trevor made this point. He said, "Now let's turn to the biggest, the most important of all the elections happening in the world." And I said, "What, India?" And but of course he meant the one that Rona is asking about. Do people in the UK really care about US politics? As a British citizen living in the US, I appreciate your insights, but I wonder if American politics matter in general, or is it just your audience? First of all, shout out for the brilliant first episode of Restless Politics US with Anthony Scaramucci and Katy Kay really, really was a good listen. And also, Rory, it did knock you and me off the top of the charts for a bit. So we have to have
Oh,
a
dearie
little word
me.
with them.
Yeah, a little word with
But
them. Yeah.
I think, look, people do care about American politics, always have. And of course, I think even people who don't follow politics closely, I think, do understand that this is one of the most consequential American elections that in our lifetime.
Exactly, because you can see if we think about the things we worry about around the world, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, the NATO alliance, or, could be poverty in Africa, could be climate change, could be almost anything that you care about. A Trump election would be negative for those things. I mean, it would accelerate the negative tendencies. I was just talking to somebody working closely allied with Biden's campaign, and one of the subjects we should talk about maybe on a main pod in a week or two's time is RFK. So Kennedy coming through as now potentially one of the three biggest factors that could lead to Biden losing that election.
I know. What? Yeah,
And,
we
and,
should talk
and the
about that.
sense that big funders are now thinking what they need to do is turn their fire on RFK,
Mm, mm.
because they see him as being and make sure that he's stealing votes from Trump rather than Biden.
It would be extraordinary if a member of the Kennedy clan turned out to be the last opening in the door to what would become the most right wing and horrendous, and to use Nancy Pelosi's word when we interviewed her, and that one's coming out next week, the most grotesque president that there has ever been. Stick with elections, Rory. Naomi Reeves. What would your percentage prediction be for how many people turn out at the next general election? I was recently shocked at my local college. Over 60% of young people said they wouldn't be voting. How can we get more turnout?
I think turnout, I'm afraid, in the British election will be low. I mean, it's I was thinking about this because you keep pushing me on the London mayoral election, and I'm doing so much to sort of hold back from saying I'm going to vote for Count Binface at the moment. But if that's the way I'm thinking, I don't know
No, you
how many
can't do
people are
that,
going to be
Roy. You
thinking.
can't do that. And by the way, Count Binface is quite an operator. Unless you correct what you just said, he will have that on his leaflets, Rory Stewart, I can't hold back from voting Count Binface. I mean, no. So that means you're voting Sadiq. Fair enough. Let's leave that now. I'm not sure about this turnout. I think very interesting. I'm going to give a shout out to a young man by the name of Dan Laws, who I met at his school in Manchester a few years ago. When I just went to do one of my talks at the school, and he introduced me. In fact, he was the one who invited me to go there. And he was probably, I can't remember how old he was, 15 or 16. And I did a tweet and a picture of me and him together. And I said, remember this name. This guy has got something. Anyway, lo and behold, last week on National Voter Registration Day, I thought, I know that face. And he popped up on my social media because he was basically leading the My Life, My Say. My Life, My Say is a kind of youth movement trying to mobilize people in politics. And there he was leading this National Voter Registration Day campaign and apparently signing up the biggest number of people to register to vote in a single day. So that is what we need. We need people like Dan Laws.
The polling expert Sir John Curtis said, you won't like this at all. He said it's going to be really low turnout. He said, we have two party leaders, three if you include Ed Davey. None of them enthuse the electorate. None of them is popular. All of them are regarded as dull as dishwater. He said, the difference between the parties is relatively narrow. Everyone thinks Labour's going to win. So what's the point of turning out to vote?
That's terrible for John Curtis to say that.
There we are.
That sounds like no. So, John, I think we all have to. Rather than, did you see Joe Biden's speech to the White House correspondence thing? When all the press come in, and he did lots of. It was very, very funny in parts. He had this great line about, yes, age is a factor. I'm a grown up against a 6-year-old, which I quite like. But he had this very serious part. He said to the media, he said, I think this is the most consequential, as I just said, the most consequential election in our lifetime. Can you guys please not cover this for what you call the horse race, all the polls and all that stuff and the gotcha moments, but actually cover what this election is actually about and the choices that the country faces. So I think if we, Naomi, if I can say this, if we all sit around saying it's going to be low turnout, it's going to be apathy is going to win, what those of us who care about politics should be doing is going out and persuading people, do you know what, you've
Well,
got to
there's something
vote.
just off the back of this. Going back to this Democrat strategist I was talking to, and I don't know whether this resonates with your experience of British elections, but he said to me very clearly, the number one thing we care about in spending money in the US is getting our people to turn out. The number two thing we care about is suppressing the other side's vote, making sure the other side doesn't turn out. And number three, and it's a long way down the list, is changing the minds of independents. Um, does that? Have you ever heard that in British politics?
Get out the vote is massively important and can make a difference, no doubt about that.
Do we talk openly about suppressing the opposition's
I
votes
don't think
quite as
I
clearly as
don't
they do
think
in
we
the
do.
US? Because that's a big deal in the
Oh
US.
yeah,
I mean, a really, really big deal.
absolutely.
You'll see, for example, they're beginning to roll into a whole series of strategies to try to make sure. Well, I mean, from the Biden point of view, what they're most worried about is places like Wisconsin, where the Republicans will be doing their very best to make sure that the Muslim community doesn't vote for him, that young people don't turn out.
Yeah.
And that's quite a large block of votes in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't talk about it. Maybe it's because there just isn't as much money in British politics, and therefore there's
Well, and
less.
thank God as well. You know, when people, I think people will really enjoy the interview with Nancy Pelosi. But when I was sort of looking into her background, I found one amazing fact that there was one election. I think it was sort of almost over a decade ago now, where the Republicans spent $65 million on demonizing Nancy Pelosi advertising. Now, that is a sum of money that would cover our entire election, which was just spent on adverts against Nancy
Attacking
Pelosi.
Nancy
It's
Pelosi.
incredible.
Yeah.
And that is not a healthy democracy. I don't care what anybody says.
Sam Walker, with the introduction, this is obviously not a question for me. With the introduction of the independent footballer regulator, do you think the government should be getting involved in sport, or should they redirect their time and money to politics? And then off the back of that, Andrea Rivlin, would you support the introduction of performance-related pay into the Premier League? Current pay is far too high. Perhaps this could work in Parliament too. There we are. What do you think of those?
The first part of the question, I do see a role for the regulator. I think there are all sorts of issues in football that are not necessarily properly addressed, and a lot of them related to the relationship between the sport at the top level and fans. Look, there is a form of performance-related pay, because even though these guys are on massive basic salaries, they also get more pretty much every week if they win, if they play, how many minutes they play, if they score. So I wouldn't worry about getting involved in that. I must say, actually, there are issues though in relation to football that I think we need to press the people who actually run the game to do far more. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I was talking this week to a guy called John Stiles, who's the son of Nobby Stiles. And Rory, please tell me you've heard of Nobby Stiles.
Nobby Stiles I've heard of.
Okay, good. Nobby Stiles was?
I can't tell you anything about him, but I have heard of him.
Okay, well, he won the World Cup for England in 1966. He was in that team. And his son was essentially saying that he died of a condition that many say is caused by the incessant heading of balls, particularly during that period. And they are really, really, really struggling to get any of the main football authorities to do anything other than sort of tick boxes and say that they're concerned about it. And he was telling me some of the stories. They were absolutely awful. And likewise, another issue which I think is really important, which doesn't get much attention, is that we talk a lot about the academies. There are thousands of kids going through the academies now. Great, they all think they're going to be footballers, but the truth is about 1 or 2% will make it. And you've then got thousands of kids who basically have, devoted their childhood and their parents as well, pushing them along. And a lot of them end up in a pretty bad way. So, and added to the whole sort of, what the money in the game and how it's spent, I think there is a role for an outside regulator.
So in my only remote football name drop, when I was doing stuff on prisons, I was did stuff with Arsene Wenger, who said that he was very concerned about young people who didn't make it. And he said that a number of the terrorist attacks in France have been conducted by people who'd been incredibly good footballers who hadn't quite made it. And he used this as a kind of symbol of some of the ways in which it can go really wrong if your whole life is oriented around.
Yeah, interesting.
Bring us to France. Helena D., please could you explain France's position on the gangs traffickers that facilitate the dangerous small boat crossings? What's our government doing to encourage the French to do more? Or do the French want the traffickers to fill the boats? France is a safe country after all. So just working through that, I mean, yes, France is a safe country. I think that's a really important thing to begin with, that people coming from France to Britain are fleeing a safe country, not a place where their human rights are at risk. And that's why I think we should be focusing on bringing people directly from places like Afghanistan or Sudan, not focusing on taking people from France. What could the government do? Well, Rishi Sunak signed a £480 million deal, which was supposed to hire more French police officers along the coast. And there have been two different stories about this. One is that the French police are being lax, which you occasionally hear from conservatives. So there was a French police officer interviewed who said that he felt sorry for them. But there have also been reports on the French police being very aggressive and using pepper spray and puncturing boats. And fundamentally, though, the most, I think, constructive idea is the idea which Labour floated, and which I hope they're going to stick with, which is to sign a proper comprehensive deal with France, which would say that we will take from France genuine asylum seekers who are really at risk. We'll reduce the burden for them. So, we could take 20,000 people a year who are coming from countries at risk to France. And in return, we will return people who come across on boats.
I mean, I think, look, we had more questions this week about Brexit and the irony of seeming to lose control of our borders, having said that Brexit was about taking back control of them. Look, first of all, this is an issue that goes back, including back to our day. I can remember when David Blunkett was Home Secretary and he was endlessly popping over the channel to see Nicolas Sarkozy, who was his opposite number at the time, and they were trying to sort of come to sensible arrangements on how to deal with some of these issues. But I think that the relations with the French government, albeit that they're better than they were when Johnson was around, I think there is still a problem with the fact that France gets so much flack from our politicians and from our media. In answer to the question, Helena's question, France's position on the gangs traffickers, I think they're as appalled at the gangs and the traffickers as we are, but I think also being very, very frustrated at the lack of serious strategy from our government. And also I think that, like in common with most sensible, serious people, they think this Rwanda thing is just absurd. And that Rishi Sunak, as we've said many times, has made a terrible mistake in elevating this to the level that he has. And of course, this week we've had this nonsense about Sunak saying, I mean, I just can't get my head around this. He says that the fact that the Irish government are now complaining that they're getting lots of asylum seekers going from the UK over the border in Ireland into the Republic, Sunak says that shows that the policy is working. I mean, what does that even mean? Because we're meant to have control of the borders, and the whole point of that border in Ireland is, and this is why, if you go back to Brexit, this is, oh God, it's just unfathomable that we've got ourselves as a country into this mess. And I don't know if you saw at the weekend, Rory, this whole thing about with all the goods coming in now, and they're going to have to, if there's a sort of any suspicion about some of the goods being brought in with these new arrangements that are coming in, they've got to drive 22 miles unsupervised to get checked. They then if they fail the checks, they're told, okay, you've got to go back now. No, then what happens? What happens if actually they decide, no, you know what, I'm not going to go back. I'm going to take this thing up to Birmingham or Glasgow or, Liverpool, wherever it might be. So we're losing control because we don't have a serious approach to this. And interestingly, the Irish government's response was to say we're going to have to ramp up the processing processes so that we can actually deal with this quickly. If only we'd have done that way back, I think we might be in a better place.
Right. Final.
Was that a bit of a rant? Sorry, I was.
That was a bit of a
okay.
rant.
Do you want to speak on in defence of the government? No.
No, I do not want to speak on defence of governance in relation to this. Good. So, Bertie Ahern, final question. Cillian Bryan, 1470. Did you ever have the opportunity of meeting Bertie Ahern? What did you make of him? Huge political figure in Ireland during his time, now highly controversial. Wondering what you made of his character. So just quick introduction before we come to you on Bertie Ahern. Hugely dominant figure in Irish politics. Somebody who was seen as a kind of consummate political operator, but also got himself involved in corruption scandals. There's a great line that I've always sort of been taken with, which is that trying to get a straight answer out of him was like punching a haystack. All you could hear was a kind of dull thud. And there's a great quote when he was put up in front of the Marne Tribunal on hundreds of thousands of euros of money that he took, or Irish pounds at the time. His great line was, "It's not correct, and if I said so, I was not correct. I cannot recall if I said it, but I did not say, or if I did, I did not mean to say it, that these issues could not be dealt with until the end of the Marne Tribunal."
That makes entire sense to me.
Lovely, exactly. Right. Okay. Tell us about Bertie
Well,
Ahern.
I have a lot of time for him. And Cillian, you need to go back in the back catalogue. We've done Bertie Ahern on The Rest is Politics Leading. I've met him hundreds of times because, of course, he was absolutely fundamental to the success of the Good Friday Agreement and all that followed. And I was very, very sad when he got his reputation really did take a hammering during these tribunals. I think it's recovered to some extent. He did a fascinating podcast series himself about the Northern Ireland peace process. But he was no doubt an operator, no doubt about that at all. Very smart, very clever, very man of the people, very kind of very good at the kind of the personal politics stuff. So he remains somebody that I admire, and I'd say he's a good friend. So I know what people say about him, but I'm not going to join in the hating. My final question, Rory. Tim Bissett. I'm amazed at how many times journalists use the word febrile and how many times politicians say something is for the birds. What are your most hated cliches and overused words and phrases in politics? I've got to say, I hear my most hated cliches and overused words and phrases in virtually every interview now.
Well, let me give you my one then, and I'll hand back to you. My one is, I've been very clear about this, which means you're totally unable to articulate any position
100%. Even worse, the Prime Minister has been very clear about this. And that's a way of saying that, I don't need to answer this really because the Prime Minister's already answered it. The other one I can't stand, I hope somebody's bound to dig up a clip of me doing this, and sometimes it is it's all you're left with. But the other one I can't stand is when somebody's asked a question and they say, well, that's not the question that's not the question you should be asking. The real question is. And then the other one, which you see people do all the time is, well, is this thing about on the doorstep? Have you noticed that every politician who ever talks about conversations they had on the doorstep, everybody on the doorstep says what they think? Well, I'm not hearing that on the doorstep. What I'm hearing on the doorstep is that Rishi Sunak has been very clear about blah 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 blah. And then the one that I really, 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 really hate in football is acres of space. I'll just leave that one there for you. Do you know what the acres of space cliche is about?
No. There's pretty a lot of room.
It's a lot of room.
To put the ball.
They say he was in acres of space, and I think he's not. He's got about 10 square yards. He's not in acres. So yeah, very good, Tim Bissett. There are books to be written about political cliches, but I'm with you, Rory. I've been very clear. The Prime Minister has been very clear. You hear that in virtually every interview now. Now, if it's a cliche, just stop it. Don't do it.
No, it's and it's amazing. And just stop for a second and say, what is it that I'm obfuscating?
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm saying this, there's something I'm conceding. Is it possible? And why weren't they? I mean, it is also amazing. You pointed out an example to me this week where there was a lot of this sort of, well, that's not the question I think that anyone's asking.
Yeah.
Often the questions are so easy. Oh, the example you were giving me, wasn't it, was an MP being asked why they had supported Boris Johnson.
Oh, no. No, the question was, I'll tell you what it was. It was Sophie Ridge's programme. And she did a thing up in Grimsby, and it was the local Tory MP who had backed Boris Johnson. And the question was, on the lines of, is Boris Johnson one of the reasons why trust in politics has fallen? Now, I think if even if you're Boris Johnson's, whoever his wife is at the moment, or you're his brother, or you're his best friend, I think you're perfectly sensible in saying, "Well, I'm afraid so, yes." But then go on to it.
Well, as you pointed out, you've got one of three answers, haven't you? You've got absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
You've got no. I think Boris Johnson's the greatest person on
Mm-hmm.
earth, or you've got a joke. He's not Mother Teresa,
Exactly,
but something Hermione
which is
came up with.
probably what I would have done if I was her.
What they come up with instead is, I don't think that's the question that people want to hear the answer to. What they want to hear about is our new policy on
Exactly.
welfare.
Nobody's talking to me about Boris Johnson on the doorstep. So we roll in another cliche for that one. When I was on the Trevor Phillips show, Trevor had pre-recorded an interview with Rishi Sunak, and it was interesting watching it because I've been in a lot of studios doing, seeing, overseeing, watching lots and lots and lots and lots of interviews. And I just sort of felt after a while that the people who were in the studio, the people who were in the back room, the people who were through the glass in the newsroom sort of weren't listening, because he wasn't answering questions. He was sort of, it was almost like, sorry to keep going back to football, but when you're in a football match and you're sort of coming towards the end, if you're kind of winning, you're 1-0 up, you sort of take the ball into the corner flag, towards the corner flag, and you try and waste time. And you sort of felt with him, the going through his mind was, I've only got 5 minutes left. I haven't really fucked it up yet. But if I keep talking and I keep talking.
I'm not a great football expert, but when you're 9-0 down, taking it to the corner flag and wasting time doesn't.
No, but
seem
he wasn't 9-0 down
all.
in the interview. I'm talking about he's doing, instead of saying, and so the headline out of the interview, the Sky's headline out of an 18-minute interview with the Prime Minister was, Rishi Sunak has not ruled out an election in July. If that's your headline, Prime Minister, out of an 18-minute interview, you have not put much thought into that interview and what you're trying to get out of it. And it wasn't even a proper conversation, because he was just trotting out all these lines, all these, and anyway, there we are.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's happened, hasn't it? And I think we were talking this about Justin Trudeau in Canada. You get to a moment maybe where people stop listening.
Yeah.
Alastair, thank you. And
see you soon.
Look forward to doing it again
See
soon.
you. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.